episode of Page Turner. Today is Wednesday, January 13th. I am joined today with Shane and Kevin. How are you guys doing?
Doing well. Doing well.
Okay.
So I appreciate you guys blowing up my phone last night. We were having dinner and my phone all of a sudden was on the counter. It just ding, 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 ding. And everyone in my family was like, whose phone is that? And I'm like, I think that's mine. And they're like, geez. Yeah. So then the funny part of it was when I finally—
It was very important what we were talking about.
Very.
Yes. So I go to look because today, given today's situation, you never know why your phone is blowing up, right? I mean, seriously, I was eating dinner trying to think what could be happening. So I go to my phone, and actually, what was the original context of the message?
Well, there was the director, wasn't it the health director of Mecklenburg County, who issued some protocols, and then Kevin had said, I've gotten some questions about this, and that led to this. And of course, you know, you always can tell, I can always tell when there's a group text, when it's just one text after another. And then Kevin and I started having a dialogue while you're copied on it. And then I realized that and then thought, well, I'm just going to just keep writing sentences just for the sake of pinging Karen's phone.
That's exactly what you did. You're like, well, I think I'm just going to keep doing this because, and then Kevin, no, then Shane, you went cough, like to ding it. And then Kevin sends a GIF of a person coughing. And then that just opened the floodgates because the GIF was from, oh gosh, what was her name? Not Rachel, on Friends. One of the characters
Phoebe.
on Friends.
It was Phoebe.
Phoebe on Friends. And then Shane is like, oh, gee, I never watched that show. And then by this point, I was finally in on the conversation and active part. And then we just went a whole another direction talking about 70s and 80s TV shows, or 80s and 90s TV shows. So that was fun.
Yeah, it was a trip down memory lane via text. It really was.
Until Kevin started posting including all the theme songs for all these old shows. And then this morning, because I had said A-Team, and then Kevin put out the A-Team intro, which we thought would be perfect for Page Turner. And I woke up this morning with the A-Team theme song in my head. I couldn't believe that. I was like, oh my God.
It's a good one.
Dun, dun,
Yeah,
dun.
and that was one of my favorite shows. You know, it's really true. There was a Halloween when my mother made for me a Mr. T costume. And how she did the mohawk is that she got like cotton balls, and I forget what the plastic sheathing she used, cotton balls, and when I put it on, it looked like I had a mohawk. And I went around and trick-or-treated, and when people would open the door, they would see this white kid kind of in Mr. T. And she gave me all of her necklaces, and I had all of her necklaces on, and they were like, oh, it's Mr. T. I don't remember many of my costumes, but I remember the Mr. T because I love that show.
Did you say I pity the fool?
You know, Karen, but when the 18 came on, I mean, she was in college by that point, but I was just a kid. I was like, I don't know, 9.
I was in high school, not college. I
had a mortgage.
Yes, because it is, some of the shows that you guys were talking about last night were too cool for me to watch when you were watching them as young toddlers. But yeah, that was fun, some of those old shows that we were talking about last night. And then I had to leave because we were now going from dinner to watching a family movie. And we watched Triple Frontier, I think that's what it's called.
A space movie?
No, it's not space, war. Military, actually, so it was really good, very gory. Pretty intense in action, but it kind of had a really good storyline that made you think at the same time.
Sounds like church life.
Any committee meeting, right?
That's right. That's right. That describes the committees. Yeah.
So I would recommend it. Triple Frontier. It's definitely different. I'm finding that as I age, that I have a hard time watching action movies and stuff, just because I'm just too old for it. I get too nervous. I can't watch. I'm like this the whole time, even though
I've never enjoyed horror movies ever. Even when I
Well,
was a youngster, I don't watch them to this day. And
it's not a horror movie.
I think it was The Exorcist that came on pay
Oh, yeah.
TV during the day. This was like on CBS, maybe just before there was cable. And I watched some of that, and I still to this day remember some of the images I saw. And ever since then, I've not really been a fan of horror, although I've got friends who love horror.
Well, I wouldn't say this was horror, because I know what horror you're talking about, like Friday the 13th, The Exorcist, all that stuff is super scary too. This was more just action, shoot 'em up, like army stuff, but it's still like action intense, scary. But it was good.
Can I be presumptuous and say that John probably picked that movie out?
He did, based on a friend's recommendation.
I know John watches this, so I just wanted to
Yeah, shout
shout out to John.
And to make us look like we're not just this like family that watches blood and guts, we did watch the Disney movie last week called Soul. Have you heard of that? Have you seen it?
That's a good one.
I've thought about commentating on that. I watched it with my daughter. It's actually very Platonic. There's a lot of Platonism, the philosophy of Plato in there. And but no, that wouldn't interest anybody. But I did see it and thought it was entertaining.
Yeah.
Don't ruin it for us, Shane.
No. It wasn't a Christian anthropology. Let me tell you that. So anyway.
Well, actually, it's interesting because we have talked about having one of our topics as kind of life after death and some of that stuff we've talked about, possibly having as a topic. But I thought that they did a really good job. I actually wasn't surprised that they even went there, like that they even went that far. Like, I'm like, is that politically correct that they're even talking that there could be an afterlife and a Lord and a God?
Mm-hmm.
And so I was surprised that they did that as a feature movie, and I thought it was well done.
Well, before we get on, to our other topics, it does indicate we're actually very curious about these issues. I think, like life after death, heaven, what is that? And I will say, as a pastor, I don't think I've ever really preached a sermon on like what is heaven and what is it like. Because we have so many caricatures of it. Most of our understandings of heaven would be projections. What we want, golf, whatever I love in earth. That's what heaven is going to be like. Whereas in the scriptures and in tradition, it's an objective reality. It's not something that we're just going to be able to canvas on which we're going to be able to paint what we want. It's an objective reality, but we do have a curiosity about these things, and it might be that we do a Zoomcast on just what's called the 4 last things. I don't know if you ever heard of that. The 4 last things: death, judgment, heaven, hell. And people are curious.
Absolutely. Inquiring minds want to know. Definitely. So, okay. So we would like to just state that we do record our page turner episodes in the morning. Usually Wednesday mornings we record. And last week we recorded and had everything done and set to go at its normal time before anything had started happening at the Capitol. So we just wanted to make that statement that when we recorded last week's episode, was not aware of what was happening when our episode went out, because it was pre-done. So we're just putting that out there. So we would like, we did feel that it was appropriate today to kind of touch on the events of last week, and to not necessarily get political, but just talk on some other aspects of it. And I think all of us are still shocked by the images that we saw, and still have feelings and emotions about that how can this be America? Like, watching and seeing those images, I did not feel like I was watching America. So I feel like there's still a lot unfolding from last week's episodes. And Shane, you did touch about it a little bit in your sermon last Sunday, and I think we're just going to dig a little bit deeper into some of that. So do you want to talk Shane, a little bit about what you said on Sunday?
Well, I think I said very briefly, just two things. Number one, in this country, we all have a right to protest peacefully, no matter what you want to protest. I mean, we can protest burnt toast, as long as we do that peacefully. It wasn't against the protesting. But then what I did say is that the mob, that's what is that stormed the Capitol building, well, that's despicable. And of course, what drives that is what has always set American democracy apart is the peaceful transition of power. That when there is a new administration that comes into being, that it would happen without arms and it would happen without violence. That's not always the case in history or in other countries. And it disturbed to the degree that we're no longer really able to say that we've always been able to transition power without incident and to do so civilly. So regardless of what political persuasion we are, I think that all of us, liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, should be just abhorred at the outbreak. But we'll get into this. It did reveal to me, again, something that I have mentioned before, and that is the power of the scapegoating mechanism. And we'll get a chance maybe to talk a little bit about it, because we saw it in action last week. And I think it's worth reminding ourselves about what that is and how it really is a driving force within each one of us.
So you had mentioned Rene Girard, right? Is that how you say his name? Rene Girard?
Rene Girard, yeah,
Girard.
French, he's French, yes. Mm-hmm.
And he's kind of the one who's kind of came up with this whole scapegoat mechanism. And he also had a mimetic theory.
Well, it's the same thing. It's the same thing. And before I go into that, Kevin, did you want to say anything? I want to, I don't want him to just.
No, I turned my microphone off because the Duke Power thing is going around.
Oh yeah, I'm hearing it as well. And I will say, I didn't even know the events of the Capitol were happening until later, much later than anybody else. I regret that to a certain extent, but I think I've confessed on this program before. I've backed away from watching news. It was sweeping me up into the outrage industrial complex. It was not good for my health. But, yes, but to your question, Karen, go ahead and finish that.
Well, no, you were asking Kevin. Kevin, did you have anything else you wanted to say? No. Okay. So do you want to talk a little bit about the scapegoat mechanism and how that turns into a mob mentality and how it actually played out exactly to that? What happened last week was almost to what this guy has said.
Yes, yeah, it's actually very simple to explain, but it's brilliant in its execution. So Rene Girard, a philosopher, was very much a historian, very conversant with literature. And he began to recognize something that just pervade ancient literature and really human society itself. So it's actually very simple to explain, I think. Here's how it is. When you look at the animals in the other part of the animal kingdom, let's think of primates or apes. Almost all animals operate on instinct. Where they have built in, they're hardwired to behave certain ways. Well, what Rene Girard noticed is that human beings as a species, we are not instinctual, we're imitative. We imitate what others are doing. We, in his words, we imitate the desires of others. So that means, you and I, we do not have our own innate desires within us necessarily. We may have things for food, but we tend to imitate what other people want. If you look back at some of the clothes that you wore in the 1980s, we were just talking about the 1980s. some of us look pretty silly, and everybody looks silly. Why? Because we were imitating what each other was wearing. You think about even today, I think they're called influencers on social media, right? They set tones, and all of a sudden everybody begins to imitate what they're doing. We are imitative. Okay, well, here's his philosophy in a nutshell. We imitate the desires of other people, which means we all basically want the same thing. And because we all want the same thing, it ultimately leads to rivalries between each other. Here's what he noticed. Communities that are in rivalry with each other, eventually, without really being aware of it, find someone within that community and project all of their hostility onto that one person called the scapegoat. Everyone therefore unites around, like a mob, unites around the one. So the war of everyone against everyone becomes a war of all against one. And then the group begins to believe that if we can just exterminate the one who's the cause for all of our problems, peace will be restored. And they expel the scapegoat. Peace is restored for a little while until the cycle begins again. And then we find someone else to project all of the blame for everything that's wrong with the world on that person, expel, rinse, and repeat. Here you go. Well, what René Girard noticed is that in the ancient literature, the pagan literature, like Greek literature, the gods are always on the side of the group scapegoating. So when the city begins to drive somebody out, it's the gods are saying, good for you. You're doing the right thing. And he saw this pattern everywhere. But then he comes to the Bible and notices something completely different. That the God of the Bible was not on the side of the group scapegoating. He was on the side of the victim. And that completely challenged his understanding. But for our purposes here, within all of us, what drives us as imitative creatures is this mob mechanism, this copying mechanism that just turns on. And we can get swept up into the group, projecting its violence onto a group of someone's or a someone. Does this make sense?
Absolutely.
And we saw it last week. How? I don't know if you saw one of the persons that were swept up said, I don't know what happened to me. Next thing you know, I'm storming the Capitol along with everybody else. That's the mechanism at work. It turned on and he got caught up in the riptide. So I'll stop there. Maybe there are some questions because there's a lot more we can say about that.
No, I don't necessarily have any questions because I think you explained it really well. And I'm also looking at an article at the same time about him and his research or his studies and stuff. And I do find it interesting about the ties to the Bible. Like that's where it's fascinating.
Yes, and of course, René Girard understood that in pagan literature and even in society itself, just in everyday life, the mob or the groups that are blaming the other for all the problems of the world, they always think they're right. They are the righteous against the unrighteous. And what he noticed, and this is actually what made him a Christian, it turned him into a Christian. I do not think he was a Christian before he began his research. Think about Jesus, what happened to him. Notice that in the story of Jesus, Jesus becomes the other around whom everyone unites in his last week, especially on Good Friday, over against him. And they think, well, if we can just get rid of him. And you see this with the Pharisees, you see this with the imperial authorities. We've got conflict happening here in Jerusalem. Who's to blame for this? It's this Jesus of Nazareth. And look at what happened. The mob came together over against this Jesus. And they all thought they were right in what they were doing. The resurrection, of course, was the contradiction. Because when Christ was raised from the dead, it was God that they were putting to death. God was the victim of the mob scapegoating mechanism. And it completely exposed, according to Girard, it exposes the mob mentality as destructive. It's not actually righteous at all. It is destructive to such an extent that it put the Messiah to death. I'm talking a little bit too much, as I always do, but Rene Girard, for instance, was being interviewed about his theory, and someone asked him about Peter, St. Peter. You remember how in the story he denied the Lord 3 times? Someone asked Rene Girard, well, why do you think Peter, who was so strong in his faith in Jesus before him, why did all of a sudden did he start denying the Lord? And Rene Girard said it was the mob. He was arrested. Jesus was arrested. All of a sudden, this fury started happening. And Peter, just like us, got swept up to the over against Jesus. And Peter did not want to be associated with it. And in a practical example, I was sharing this before we started recording. You ever been in a committee meeting and you were sure of what your opinion was on this, and next thing you know, the whole group is going in a different direction and you feel like you have to go with the group, you're swept up. So that's kind of an idea, and it happens without us even thinking, but it's dangerous. And what Christianity, unlike the other pagan religions of the ancient world, taught us is that God is usually on the other side. It's not the righteous act that we tend to think that it is. I'm probably not doing justice there, but I'll stop talking.
So, okay, while you were like, while I'm reading this and listening to you talk about this and thinking it deeper, do you think that Satan is on the other side of it?
Satan is, according to Girard and his theology, Satan is the accuser. That's what it literally means. Satan is the mechanism at work. So when we see the mechanism at work, it is satanic, not the red devil, but it is the accusatory mechanism in all of us, over against the other. So it's brilliant that you mentioned that. So that's in Girardian theology. Satan is the manifestation of the scapegoat mechanism, mob mentality at work in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely
eliminate the one. If you can just eliminate that one person or that one group, peace will be restored. Yeah, that's false. It's false.
Kevin, anything to add to that?
No, I think when you're talking about Jesus on the cross, it has that term scapegoating has its origins in Judaism.
It does.
So every year they would symbolically put the sins of the community on this animal and expel that animal into the forest to get rid of their sins. Mm-hmm. And of course I love history, and watching the events last week, I keep thinking of how does this happen? Well, it happened at the Salem witch trials. It happened in Nazi Germany. It's not, sadly, it's not unique, and it happens quickly. And I think I was reading about Girard too, Shane, and I read about an experiment right after World War II. They were doing an experiment with people that were supposedly guards, and they could deliver shocks to people if they wanted to. They weren't real shocks, and by and large, these people were choosing to give shocks to restore order, and how scary that was. And they decided, that Nazism could have happened in America because of the same reason we're talking about today. So it's terrifying.
Yes, and what Jesus actually does, and here I'm invoking the works of a James Allison, who is a Girardian theologian who was very much influenced by it, is that if you really study Jesus carefully, and what he is instructing his disciples to be is to see the world from the vantage point, not of the group in power, but of the victim, to give them the meek, the gentle, the nonviolent, the excluded, so that in community with themselves, we as followers of Jesus will not participate in victimizing anyone. And James Allison, and there's 1,000 different ways to look at what peace means. This is just James Allison's, based on Rene Girard's theology, that the kind of peace that Jesus was able to effect among the church in the early days is that when he appeared to his disciples, the disciples were able to say, we got caught up in a violent system, and look what we did. We killed this man as a result of it, but he's come back to us now. He's exposed the scapegoat mechanism for what it is, false. And now we need to live differently in the world and not create victims of anyone else. But this does drive human behavior. And you see it on Twitter. Twitter mobs. All of a sudden, everybody is over against somebody who has said something, and they just, pelt the person with mean tweets and all of these other things. So it's really an interesting and fascinating observation of human behavior and how we can get caught up into it, and how Jesus's resurrection, his death, he was the victim who was put to death innocently, and yet for the group, he was put to death justly. We've got to stop it. We've got to stop it. Yeah.
Well, and I think your statement that you made last week afterwards kind of hit home. And I think because, we physically weren't there storming the Capitol, but all of us in some way or another have contributed to what's happening. And you also mentioned words, and our words can really create a lot of anger and hatred and how we treat each other. And unfortunately, I saw that last week as well as a result of this, seeing a friend in tears because of social media and what they were saying that she felt was being directed towards her, which she wasn't at Capitol. She wasn't there. She doesn't believe in that violence and that behavior, but she's linked in some regard. And so now, it's just really sad that we can't treat each other with
Well,
respect.
that too is the scapegoat mechanism at work. I mean, as soon as you blame someone for all that is wrong, you are a part of the scapegoat mechanism. And the reason we tend, according to Girard, the reason we tend to blame the other is because it's so good at creating a sense of identity for us. The group identity almost depends on the group being against someone else. I mean, you think about sports, I'm a Tar Heel, a Carolina fan. Well, my identity, if you really just look at sports, yeah, we can talk about how we're fans, but what really unites us as Carolina fans is Duke, the rival. And we have such a group identity based on being over against someone else. And that's why politics is so effective. You think about Democrats as a group, Republicans as a group, well, we are against these people. And yet we actually need the other to understand who we are. And that always leads to violence. And yet as Christians, our identity is supposed to be connected to the victim of violence. You see the difference? We are actually supposed to be identified with Christ, who was a victim of the over against mentality. And if you read the Passion narrative, everybody is united around Jesus. They couldn't agree beforehand, but all of a sudden, when it comes to getting Jesus crucified, you had the Pharisees cooperating with the governor and Pilate. You had groups of people coming together. There was unity through this scapegoating mechanism, and that's why it's so powerful. So we got to stop. And social media can really stir this up. You can have a mob energy even on social media.
So that would be my kind of wrap up question would be, okay, this has been happening for centuries. How do we change? What can we do, our little selves and our little bubbles, what can we do to make a difference into the future and treating others? Like, is there something we can be doing or not doing?
Well, I would say what drives your behavior. Look, we're not very good at being self-critical. That's why you have to go to a doctor, and the doctor has to diagnose you, because we're not good at diagnosing ourselves. I would say to all of us, how do you understand yourself? Like, if I were to tell you, how do you identify who you are and list the characteristics? How much of who you are is connected to the group? And really assess how your group identity could be more or less based on your opposition to someone who's not in the group. Going back to the sports analogy, our identity as Christians should be in Christ. And pay attention to the accusation mechanism. You know, it's your fault, the accuser, how much that drives us. And because it's a mechanism. Again, a mechanism does not mean necessarily DNA. It just means it's a switch that goes off. And we are not supposed to be over against anyone as this other. I don't know, maybe that's not very helpful, but just assess group, how you identify yourself, how much of that is based on the group.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Kevin, anything else to add?
I would just say humility as well. I'd add to that. To be willing to admit maybe you don't have it, you don't have all the answers, or who you were tied up with and the identity was, you know, didn't have all the answers. To be open to other ideas and listen. That's more of a practical.
Yeah.
Yeah, you should never let the persons with whom you disagree drive your sense of self. And that they should not, and if you are reacting, if you are reactive to those with whom you disagree, that's power. They have power over you. They actually do. And really, and here I'm invoking James Allison, and it's been a while since I read some of his works, but we want to get to the place as Christians where we are non-reactive. That doesn't mean that we're robots and stones and rocks, but we don't want anything to have power over us to cause us to react. You know, we want to live peacefully, and part of living peacefully is learning how to live non-reactively. Because if we're reacting against something, that's something against which we're reacting. It's actually got a hold on us. And if I'm with my family and I mention a certain political party and everybody goes through the roof, well, that's actually saying something. The other side's got a lot more power than it should for the family's sense of identity, even though that's a hypothetical. But does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I was thinking of,
non-reactively. Yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
I was just thinking about in scripture when the guy's in the temple and he says, I thank you, God, that I'm not like that Pharisee.
Yes.
That is, he's defining himself in front of God by who he's not.
That's right. Perfect illustration on that. And you see the scapegoat mechanism in the Gospels. I'm thinking right now of the woman caught in adultery. Remember the big mob drove her, I'm going to stone her. It was the all against the one. And then Jesus diffused that by saying, whoever is without sin, cast the first stone. But yeah, Kevin is exactly right. Perfect illustration. We do tend to understand who we are, define ourselves based on who we are not. It drives us. And it always leads inevitably to group violence of some sort.
It's so sad.
And Christ returned as the victim. He returned as the victim of this group violence and forgave us. And now we can assess who we are in light of Christ saying, yeah, I'm guilty of that way of living. I'm sure that I have hurt the innocent. I have made victims of those unjustly. Now I'm forgiven. I shall now live a different way. And I will try to see the world from those who are scapegoated and not pretend to think anymore that God is on my side when I do that. Because the cross shows us, the cross was the victim, Jesus, and God was with him.
God's on our side, we're on God's side.
Right.
I think you might have said that once in the sermon.
Well, I think it's Abraham Lincoln too.
Oh, really?
Abraham Lincoln said it's not the question is not whose side is God on, but are we on God's side? I think it was Abraham Lincoln who said that. So yeah.
Awesome.
I just equated you to Abraham Lincoln. Just take the compliment.
I just don't have the hat, you know.
I can get you the hat. You got to get the beard.
Yeah.
Well, that was really good conversation and insight, and hopefully gives people some peace during this time, because I don't think it's going to get easier for a while. I think we're still going to have some, I don't know, just it's some intense days ahead. So hopefully going forward, we can try to live a little more peacefully. One last announcement, or one announcement, I guess, is don't forget your book, the 30-Day Experience Apprenticeship with Jesus. Our book study starts this week with the first sermon starting this Sunday. There's still time for you to get the book and to catch up. We're not, I think we're just starting.
Well, the chapters are so brief too. So if someone doesn't have the book, you can catch up really in no time.
Yeah. So, and if you would like to be put in a small group, you don't have to, but if you'd like to, you can do that as well by reaching out to Sherry Carpenter, and she'll plug you in. I think we've had a pretty good response.
Very pleased. I'm very happy with the response. I've never done a book study sermon series before, and I'm looking forward to it. Looking forward to the challenge. And it's a concept of discipleship that we really need to consider a little bit more. Following Jesus as apprenticing ourselves with Jesus. And that's a good nuance for us to keep in mind.
Kevin, did your book come in?
Yeah, then my wife took it, so I've got to steal it back.
Did you get the large text? Because
no, I didn't, but that's okay. I just read it really close.
No, I can't read it close. I have to read it far away.
Oh, yeah.
I need to get.
Right, you are older. We've covered that already today.
Oh, goodness. Well, as always, it was good seeing you guys. Hope to see you in person soon. For all those watching and listening, thank you for joining us today. And we'll be back next week. Take care.